Advanced Health Sciences Psychology, B, Virtual Interactive Notebook 5, Day 4, Post-Traumatic Stress Disorder. Your essential question, how is post-traumatic stress disorder diagnosed? The main idea is PTSD. The subtopics are exposure, symptoms, men and women, and social support. And today's reading comes from Chapter 15, Section 6. All right, so to start this, we have to remember that trauma is defined as exposure to an event that ends life or could end life or causes serious injury or could cause serious injury. All right, so trauma is exposure to an event that ends or could end life or causes serious injury or could cause serious injury. So for exposure, I want you to write 2 traumatic events. You don't have to define trauma unless you want to, because we've already defined trauma in earlier notes. All right? So a person is exposed to trauma. Now, that doesn't necessarily mean that they will get PTSD, right? So there are people who are exposed to trauma and don't display any symptoms of PTSD. And then there are people who do. All right. So symptoms. 1, intrusive and distressing memories. The person constantly remembers the traumatic event. All right. 2, flashbacks. A flashback is the person sort of like having a hallucination. They relive the memory for seconds or minutes in their head. So one example is people who've been in war. If they hear firecrackers go off, they might have a flashback. It might trigger a flashback because their mind has a way to deal with explosions, and that is to seek cover, right? So at a fireworks display, boom. If someone's not expecting it, they might dive for cover. They might dive under a table or something like that, right? And I guess for the people around them, that could seem comical, but for the people who are experiencing it is definitely not comical. It's frightening. A person who has a flashback is in fear for their life. All right. Persistent negative emotional state. So bad feelings that last. All right. Detachment. Feeling that they are not part of society around them. A feeling of detachment. Irritability, so they're easy to annoy. Emotional outbursts. These will seem as uncontrolled emotional outbursts, and they seem wild to the people around the person who has PTSD. So I was in the National Guard, and there were plenty of people with PTSD in the National Guard, and sometimes someone would just lose it completely for what I thought was no reason at all. And as a young soldier, I thought, well, that person, I don't like them. But then you find out, no, they're combat veterans, and something went the wrong way, and they just went, blah, untreated PTSD maybe. And exaggerated startle response. So if you go up to me and you say, boo, ah, right, I'll do something like that. Well, someone with PTSD might do way more than that, right? Those of you living with people with PTSD, or if you have PTSD, have probably been exposed to that exaggerated startle response. There's someone who I think probably has PTSD in my life, and they definitely have an exaggerated startle response. I mean, if something's happening, they go into fight or flight right now, just immediately. So, okay. Now you can have exposure to trauma and have some of these symptoms, but it doesn't rise to the level of PTSD because it doesn't negatively impact your life. So, for example, how to say this? It's pretty likely you're going to be exposed to trauma in your life, right? Exposure to trauma is a common human experience, right? Loads and loads of people are exposed to trauma every year, and the odds that you're going to get exposed to trauma at some point in your life are fairly high. So I've been exposed to trauma a few times. There have been a couple situations where I happened to be around where someone's life was threatened, and there was one situation where I happened to be around where life was lost, and that was in a traffic accident. It happened right in front of me, and I think about it multiple times a day. So is that an intrusive and distressing memory? Yeah, but it's someone crossed a lane like that, and then I went out to help, and I saw trauma. But it doesn't. I don't have flashbacks. What it does do is if I'm driving, I really don't like 2-lane roads where traffic goes the opposite way, and that's mostly what we have out here. So when I'm driving, I have a heightened response, and you guys might. I'm only saying this to illustrate it. This is common, right? Ask most adults, and they'll have an experience like this. This does not single me out. I don't need sympathy, and I do not have PTSD, which is my point. But it does affect me. So when I'm driving on, I much prefer highways where everybody's going the same direction. I don't like this. So what it causes is like heightened awareness. I'm not panicked. It doesn't keep me from driving to work, even though I have to drive to work on roads that I don't like. I think that it might actually be beneficial because there have been a couple times when someone has crossed the median, and I dealt with it very well. I mean, so well that my wife was shocked that we didn't get into an accident. And the reason why was I was aware the whole time. So I saw the car coming over early, and I got over early and prevented. This has happened a few times. One time, this truck was coming this way, and there was this big metal pipe in the back, and it swung out across most of our lane of traffic. But I had seen that the shoulder, which had been a ditch, at that point leveled off like this. And I went, oh, okay, like that. And we were spraying gravel all over the place, but it was fine. And I looked over at my wife. That might have been causing trauma to her. She was like that, and I was fine because I saw the whole thing happening, right? And that also explains why you guys tell me so much. Yeah, I saw you driving and I waved and you didn't even know I was there. I don't know you're there. I'm watching the road. And the reason why is I have this traumatic memory that pops into my head 3-4 times a day, minimum. And I saw the thing happen when I was 30 years old and I'm 45 now. So, but it doesn't negatively impact my life, right? So there may be an evolutionary or a psychological purpose for this. I saw something really bad happen, and because I'm aware of it, it causes me to avoid that thing, right? That's actually a survival benefit. But if it were to get to the point where I can't get into my car and drive anymore, that could be PTSD. Or when I do drive, I get super angry and I have big emotional outbursts if I have to drive on one of those roads, which are most of the roads we have out here. That would rise to the level. Okay. Another thing you'll see, especially on Facebook for some reason, PTSD is often associated with veterans for obvious reasons, because veterans see trauma in combat. But people also want you to be aware that it's not just veterans who get PTSD. That's useful. What is not useful, in my opinion, what is in fact ridiculous, is to say that somehow veterans get all the PTSD credit and the rest of us don't, or something like that. I've seen that, and that's bizarre to me. And I don't think that. I think it's good to recognize that PTSD comes from trauma, whether the trauma happens in war, whether it happens in child abuse is a common one, or survivors of like sexual violence or home invasions, things like that. All of these things can cause PTSD. In fact, one of the highest rates of PTSD occurs in nurses in emergency rooms, right? Why not so much doctors? There's a lot of that ER doctors, at least the thing I read, have a lower incidence of PTSD. It could be because the nurses are with the patients more and they sort of more emotionally identify with the patients. They find out the name, they talk to you, they try to make you feel better and things like that. And ER nurses lose people all the time. Right. Well, that is by definition trauma. So they have sky high rates of PTSD. So those people who do that are heroes. All right. Because you're volunteering for it. PTSD, men and women. 3.6% of adult men have PTSD. 9.7% of adult women have PTSD. It's like 2 to 3 times the rate of PTSD as men. And a lot of that has to do with abuse. And that's as far into that as we're going to go. All right, so what treats PTSD? Talk therapy, social support is a big one. So under social support, write down prevents/treats. So one thing that therapists will do if they're talking to people with PTSD is they'll try to get them to gather around their social support. And social support is just people who let you know that you love them, right? So in the case of veterans who come home to a loving family and a community that is supportive of them are way less likely to get PTSD than veterans who come home and that doesn't happen. So veterans who came home from World War II came back to a massive support system where people thanked them. Now, that generation didn't really talk about their experiences of war. That's a very common thing to say. But when they came back, they were welcomed as heroes and their families gave them love and affection. We're happy to have them back. Veterans who came home from Korea weren't treated negatively, but Korea was a non-event unless you were there, which is sad and horrible. But the social support wasn't there. So you get higher levels of PTSD, suicide, homelessness, etc. Vietnam, veterans who came back, and this is a fact, veterans who came back were despised by a good part of society. So they weren't welcomed back as heroes, and they weren't just ignored, they were actively disliked. And you get sky-high rates of suicide and homelessness and depression and PTSD. Right? The last figure that I read said that at least 150,000 veterans of Vietnam have committed suicide. 55,000 veterans of Vietnam actually died in Vietnam. Well, if you count the suicides, then the casualty rate of Vietnam is at least 200,000, not 55,000. Right? And a big reason, perhaps the big reason, is the lack of social support. Right? Okay, so I have included video of a veteran. And I've included this because every time I teach this lesson, this is the video that I just kind of gravitate to. Because the veteran in this video, she describes what happened and what it feels like. And there's no self-pity or anything like that. She's just sort of telling you how it is. And I think it's a valuable thing to see. Now, if you think you have PTSD, and I can just about guarantee that some of you have PTSD, then what you want is to gather social support, and you probably want to get into some talk therapy if you can, because these symptoms are real and they can be successfully managed. Right? Okay, thank you very much for sticking with me through that.